I don't want to see you at the wedding. That sentence is the reason I am telling this story. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning, because for a long time people tried to turn it into something else. A misunderstanding, a moment of stress, wedding nerves, but it wasn't any of that. It was a decision, and it was spoken out loud, calmly, in front of witnesses, by the daughter of the man I loved and stood beside for 10 years. My name is Mabel Washington. I am 58 years old. I was a nurse for most of my adult life, the kind who worked night shifts, double shifts, holidays, and never complained because patients still needed care no matter what day it was. I married Frank when I was 48. He was a widower with one daughter, Grace. I did not come into that marriage looking to replace anyone. I came in looking to build something steady and decent for the second half of my life. What I did not expect was to be erased. A few people from the church committee stood nearby pretending to be busy, but I could feel every ear turn toward us the moment Grace spoke. "I don't want to see you at the wedding," she repeated, slower this time, letting it sink in. Not in the audience, not in the pictures, not anywhere. I felt my chest tighten, but I stayed where I was. 10 years as a nurse teaches you how to stand still when your body wants to collapse. Grace looked around the room and laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to invite others in. "Let's be honest," she said. "She's not my real mother. She's just the woman my dad married, and frankly, having her there would be embarrassing." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. No one told her to stop. "She likes to act like she built this family," Grace went on, her voice gaining confidence. "But all she ever did was write checks and play hero. Anyone can do that." "I'm sorry." The words stung, sharp and personal, cutting through years of quiet sacrifice. I felt heat rush to my face, but what hurt more than the insult was what came next. Frank clapped. Once. Then again. Not loudly, not enthusiastically, just enough. Enough to show agreement. Enough to show whose side he was on. The sound echoed in the hall, louder than it had any right to be. I stared at him, waiting for him to stop, to realize what he was doing. His hands came together one last time, and then he nodded at Grace with a tight smile, like a proud father watching his daughter speak her truth. That was when my stomach dropped. Grace turned back to me, her eyes cold now, stripped of pretense. "Since we're clearing the air," she said, "we might as well finish." I remember thinking she was enjoying this far too much. "You should stop pretending you were ever here out of love," she continued. "You were useful. That's it." And stayed. I opened my mouth to speak, but she raised her hand. "And before you try to act surprised," she said, "you might want to remember those papers you signed last year." The room went completely silent. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What papers?" I asked. Grace smiled. "The property transfer," she said lightly. "The ones Dad and I had you sign when we said it was for refinancing. You didn't even read them, did you?" I turned to Frank so fast my neck hurt. "Frank?" He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He just sighed, like a tired man finally relieved of a burden. "It was easier this way," he said. "You trusted us." That word trusted hit me harder than any insult. Grace stepped closer. "You paid for most of the house," she said. "That's true. But legally, it's not yours anymore. Dad made sure of that." I felt dizzy. The edges of the room blurred. I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. "You used me," I said, my voice barely audible. Grace shrugged. "You offered." Frank didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, as if avoiding my eyes could erase what he'd done. I had written the checks. I had covered the mortgage when his business slowed. I had paid for Grace's college expenses when scholarships fell short. I had fronted wedding deposits because it would all work out later. And while I was doing that, they were planning. Together. I felt something inside me crack open, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical, like my chest had been split down the middle and left exposed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just rejection, it was betrayal. Public, calculated, final. I looked around the room. The same people who had eaten my casseroles, who had hugged me at Christmas services, who had called me generous and kind, now they avoided my eyes. Grace folded her arms again. "So," she said, "now you understand. Don't come to the wedding. Don't show up at the house. Just disappear." I nodded. "All right," I said. She blinked, clearly not expecting that. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't expose them then and there. I simply picked up my purse, walked past Frank without touching him, and left the hall. The drive home felt unreal, like I was floating outside my body. My hands stayed steady on the steering wheel, even though everything inside me was screaming. That night, I packed one suitcase. Frank stood in the doorway watching me, his face pale, his mouth opening once like he might say something that could still matter. He didn't. I left the house keys on the counter next to Grace's wedding binder. I slept in my car that night, in a diner parking lot, the neon sign buzzing above me. I stared straight ahead, too shocked to cry, too broken to feel anger yet. By morning, the shock had settled into something colder, clearer. They didn't just want me gone from the wedding. They wanted me erased from the story. They thought they had already won. What they didn't understand was this. You can trick someone into signing papers, but you can't erase the weight they carried without consequences. I went back to the house while Frank was at work. I walked through each room slowly, touching nothing, noticing everything. In the study, I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the documents I hadn't read closely enough before. My name had been removed. That was when the pain finally turned into resolve. If I was going to disappear, I would disappear completely. And when I did, everything they had quietly taken for granted would vanish with me. That was the beginning. Not the house sale. Not the confrontation. Not the binder of proof. It began with humiliation, applause, and betrayal. And it would end very differently than they expected. If this story resonates with you, tap like and comment where you're watching from. You might not be the only one in your town who needs to hear this. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I closed my eyes for a few hours in the front seat of my car, parked behind a 24-hour diner off Highway 42. The windows fogged up just enough to blur the neon signs outside, and the distant hum of truck engines kept me company. Around 3 a.m, I got out and walked into the diner, more for the bathroom than the coffee, but I ordered a cup anyway. It tasted like burnt rubber, but I drank every drop. At 5 a.m., the sky was still dark. I drove back to the house. Frank was at work. Grace had probably gone back to her apartment downtown. The house was empty and still, too still. The kind of silence that settles only after something has died. I stepped inside and shut the door quietly behind me, like I was trespassing in my own life. The morning light filtered through the windows just enough to cast long shadows across the floor. I stood in the entryway for a full minute, just breathing, listening to the refrigerator hum, the heater kick on, the faint creak of wood settling. This had once been a home, our home. Now it was a stage where I'd been told to exit. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The grief hadn't reached that part of me yet. It was still wrapped tight in shock, layered with shame. I walked through each room slowly, deliberately. The living room smelled like cinnamon from the candle I'd lit last week. The throw blanket on the couch still had a fold from where I'd tucked it around Frank's legs during movie night. Our last movie night, I realized. Upstairs, I opened the closet and pulled out my winter coat, the one Frank gave me 2 Christmases ago. I didn't want it for sentimental reasons, it was just the warmest thing I owned. I packed lightly. 1 duffel bag, 2 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, my old work shoes, and the flannel robe I never traveled without. I left the dresses I wore to Grace's graduations hanging neatly. I left my wedding ring in its box on the dresser. I paused by the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines. The titles blurred: cookbooks, poetry, old church bulletins I never got around to tossing. I picked out one book, a worn copy of The Color Purple, annotated and underlined from when I taught a Sunday book club. That came with me. In the office, I sat at Frank's desk. The wedding binder was still there, color-coded, labeled, organized to the minute. The florist's invoice was paper-clipped to the front, marked paid. I had written that check. Underneath it, I found the manila folder labeled House Refinance 2022. My name had once been on those papers, not anymore. The legal transfer had gone through last summer, right after Grace's birthday. I remembered the day. Frank said we needed to sign updated documents for a better interest rate. He handed me a pen while we stood in the kitchen. "Just here," he said, tapping the page with his index finger. I hadn't read the fine print. I was tired. He said it was routine. I signed. I sat back in the office chair and stared at that folder. The betrayal was almost elegant in its simplicity. They hadn't shouted. They hadn't threatened. They had smiled and waited and let me hand everything over willingly. I turned on the desk lamp and started gathering files. Financial records, tax returns, receipts, everything that showed what I had paid for the house, the repairs, Grace's tuition top-offs, the caterer deposits, the emergency vet bills for the dog Grace once brought home and then abandoned 6 months later. I took out an empty binder from the supply closet, black with silver rings, the kind accountants use. I divided it with tabbed pages: mortgage, utilities, education, medical, wedding, extras. Under extras, I wrote a note to myself. All the things they forgot I did. The binder wasn't revenge. It was record-keeping. If they wanted me gone, then fine, I would disappear. But not without taking the truth with me, and not without making sure they had to sit with it. I looked around the office one last time. The desk still had the scratch from where I dropped a stapler 2 years ago. The chair had an indent where I sat every Saturday morning to pay bills. This had been my life. This was what I had built. They'd smiled at me while they erased me. I put the binder in my duffel bag, zipped it up, and stood. In the kitchen, I found the key bowl. I hesitated. Then I took my set of keys and slipped them back into my coat pocket. Not yet. I walked outside and stood on the porch. The wind had picked up, and the trees were bare, their branches shaking like they were trying to tell me something. Across the street, our neighbor Rick was raking leaves. He looked up, gave a polite wave. He didn't know. No one did. Not yet. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I'd seen enough. At the motel on the edge of town, the receptionist gave me a room key without asking questions. Weekly rates, no ID required, just cash. The room smelled like bleach and cheap soap. The curtains didn't close all the way. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling. The pattern of bumps and swirls looked like a map of some other world. For the first time in 10 years, there were no sounds in the house I lived in. No footsteps, no humming from the next room, no one asking what was for dinner. It was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was mine. That night, I opened the binder and started adding notes. Real numbers, dates, copies of checks. Every page was evidence, not against them, for me. To prove I was never just the woman who wrote checks. To prove I had been there. That I had built something. That they hadn't broken me. Not completely. Not yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a semi-truck's engine groaning outside the motel window. It was barely 6:30, and the sun hadn't fully risen yet. A thin gray light bled through the curtain crack, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. I sat up slowly, my back aching from the motel mattress, and stared at the cheap painting above the bed, 3 faded tulips on a canvas that had seen better decades. My coffee maker at home was timed to brew at 6:45 sharp. That morning, there was no smell of fresh coffee, no sound of the floor creaking outside the bedroom. Just me, the binder, and the reality of what I'd walked away from. I showered, changed into clean clothes, and pulled my hair back into a bun. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the lines etched deeper around my mouth than I remembered. Grief does that, it ages you overnight. By 7:15, I was parked outside the Maple Grove branch of North Star Credit Union. It was a red brick building with blue shutters and a flagpole out front, the same bank I'd been going to since Frank and I got married. I used to come here with Grace in the back seat, teaching her how to open a savings account, showing her how to endorse a check. Today, I walked in alone. The woman behind the counter had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said brightly. "How can I help you?" "I need to look at a few joint accounts," I said. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Of course. May I see your ID?" I handed her my driver's license. She typed for a while, then motioned for me to follow her to a small cubicle near the back. The walls were paper thin, and I could hear the printer across the room spitting out someone else's balance sheet. She pulled up the screen. "Looks like you're co-owner on the following: checking, savings, and the joint investment account tied to the mortgage. Is that right?" I nodded. "That's right." We went through them one by one. I didn't touch anything yet. I just asked questions. I wanted to know what had my name on it and what didn't, what Grace and Frank had closed or moved, what I was legally entitled to access. I took notes in the little spiral pad I kept in my purse, the same one I used to track my patient's symptoms when I was still working at the hospital. When I walked out of that bank, I sat on the bench outside for a few minutes, letting the cold morning air settle in my lungs. A woman was buckling her toddler into a car seat a few feet away. The little boy shrieked with laughter, refusing to sit still. She was clearly exhausted, but she laughed too. A deep, tired sound that reminded me of the years I'd worked pediatric ER shifts, soothing crying babies while holding back tears of my own. That woman would never know that I had just confirmed how easily a person's presence could be erased. Frank and Grace had done it by the book. It wasn't just betrayal. It was organized betrayal. Later that afternoon, I stopped at the county clerk's office. I'd avoided it for weeks, always too busy, too trusting. The waiting room was cold and quiet, full of plastic chairs and government posters curling at the corners. When my number was called, I stepped up to the desk and asked to see the current title of our house. The clerk, a young man with thick glasses and a name tag that read Mason, asked for my ID and typed something into his computer. After a pause, he turned the screen slightly toward me. "There you are," he said. The deed was updated in June. My name wasn't on it, only Frank's and Grace's. A legal transfer of ownership. No co-signer, no caveats. I stared at the screen for a long time. "You okay?" Mason asked gently. I nodded. "I am now." I walked out with a printed copy and folded it neatly into my binder. My hands didn't shake, not even a little. Somewhere between humiliation and clarity, something had settled in me. Not anger, not even grief anymore. It was purpose. They had taken my name off the house. Now I would take my name back, and everything that came with it. That evening, I returned to the motel and laid the binder open on the small round table by the window. I began tabbing sections, one for each year of expenses, each sacrifice, each invisible gift. I found receipts from hardware stores where I'd paid to fix the leaking roof. Frank said he'd get to eventually. I printed emails where I'd corresponded with Grace's college advisor when she nearly flunked her sophomore spring. I included grocery lists from the weeks I'd covered meals while Frank was recovering from surgery. Every piece was evidence, not for a courtroom, for conscience. As I filed everything, I added post-it notes with handwritten captions. Repaired HV, summer of 2020 $2,700. Florist deposit, $800, paid from my personal checking. Car insurance for Grace, 18 months during grad school. Each note was small, almost tender in its recollection. I wasn't doing this to destroy anyone. I was doing it to protect the memory of who I had been. They wanted to pretend I never existed. This binder would prove I had. It was nearly midnight when I finished. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling again. Same bumps and swirls. But this time, I didn't feel lost. I felt grounded. Tomorrow, I would see a real estate agent. Not to ask. To inform. If they had taken the house from me in silence, I would let them feel its absence out loud. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The motel room was cold, even with the heater buzzing. I wrapped myself in my robe, the one I'd taken from the house, and sat by the window with a cup of instant coffee in a styrofoam cup. It tasted like regret, but it was warm. I didn't rush. I watched the sky lighten shade by shade, a slow, soft burn over the bare trees. I thought of my mother then, how she used to say, "When the world hurts you, child, don't scream. Just go quiet, go smart." She had been a maid her whole life, scrubbing rich folks' floors with pride, never letting anyone make her feel smaller than she was. I held on to those words as I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Dave Miller," the voice answered. Familiar. Gruff. A little surprised. "Mabel?" "Hi, Dave," I said. "You still in real estate?" He chuckled. "Still closing deals and drinking too much coffee. You buying or selling?" "Selling," I said. "Fast." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for both of us to remember that I lived in that house with Frank. "You sure?" "Yes." He didn't ask why. That was one thing I liked about Dave. He wasn't a man who needed the full story to do his job. "All right," he said. "Come by the office this afternoon. Bring whatever paperwork you've got. By 3 p.m., I was sitting across from him in his corner office on Main Street. A pot of burnt coffee sat between us, the same one he'd probably been using for the past decade. The walls were lined with old property photos and newspaper clippings from when the housing market crashed and came back again. I slid the deed copy across the table. "This is the latest title." He scanned it. "You're not on it." "I was," I said, keeping my voice even. "I paid for most of it, but my name's gone now." He looked up. "You want to fight that?" I shook my head. "No, I want to sell it. Fast. Clean." He nodded slowly, understanding. "It'll cause a stir." "I know. You ready for that?" I leaned forward. They clapped when their daughter told me to disappear. "I'm ready." He didn't smile, but he did start pulling forms from a drawer. We spent the next hour going through disclosures, signatures, listing language. I answered his questions clearly, like I was back on a medical chart, ticking off vital signs. I had all the documents, repair receipts, appraisal history, a copy of the key. He gave me a listing timeline, photos in 2 days, sign on the lawn Friday, open house Sunday. "It'll move fast," he said. "Inventory's low." I know, it is a bit to mail. When I left his office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt final. On the way back to the motel, I stopped at the grocery store. Not because I needed anything, but because I didn't want to go back to that silent room just yet. I wandered through the aisles, touching labels, reading ingredients I didn't care about. In the canned soup section, I saw a woman in her 60s arguing gently with her husband about sodium content. I used to do that with Frank. Funny how marriage settles into those tiny things, the way you argue over soup, the way you fold towels, the way you know someone's lying before they even finish the sentence. When I got back to the motel, I sat down with the binder. I added a new section, Property. In it, I tucked the listing agreement, the valuation estimate, and a note that simply said, "Scheduled for sale, 11 a.m., Friday." The next morning, I went back to the house. Frank was at work. Grace wouldn't be there. I used the spare key, the one they didn't know I still had. I didn't touch much, just the things that were mine and mine alone. My father's watch from the war, a quilt my aunt sewed when I graduated nursing school, my recipe box with grease-stained index cards, each one in my own handwriting. I left the wedding gifts. I left the matching mugs. I left the houseplants Grace had insisted on placing in every room. I walked through the place like a stranger. The energy had shifted. The warmth was gone. Even the light coming through the windows felt colder somehow. I stopped in the kitchen, right where Grace's binder still sat on the counter. She hadn't moved it since the day she threw her words like knives. I opened it. Everything was still there. Guest list, seating chart, timeline, vendor contracts. I flipped to the page marked Rehearsal Dinner. Location, home. I smiled without warmth. Not anymore. I placed a sticky note right on that page. This venue is no longer available. Then I closed it, gently, and walked out. On Friday morning, Dave texted me a photo. The for sale sign was up. White background, red letters. His name underneath, and mine too legally, no. But symbolically, very much yes. I didn't reply. Instead, I went for a walk along the trail near the lake. The wind was sharp, biting my cheeks, and the sky was gunmetal gray. But I kept walking, every step carving distance between me and the life that had tried to erase me. Around noon, my phone started buzzing. Frank, Grace. Unknown numbers. I let it ring. At 12:47, a voicemail came through. It was Grace. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice shook with disbelief. "Do you know how this looks? Do you know what you're doing?" I sat down on a park bench, phone still in my hand. She was finally starting to feel what I'd been made to carry in silence. And I wasn't done yet. I didn't listen to the rest of Grace's voicemail. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew what came next. Anger, followed by panic, then the tears, then the blame. I had heard it all before, in one form or another, from patients, from families, from people who thought love gave them the right to use you and still demand more. But this time, the voice was my stepdaughter's, and the betrayal was bone deep. Later that afternoon, I returned to the house one final time. The new owners wouldn't take possession for a few more weeks, but I had already signed the paperwork, and the real estate agent was finalizing the open house schedule. The for sale sign in the yard stood like a monument, plain, clean, inarguable. I parked 2 blocks away, not because I had to, but because I didn't want to see Rick from next door or explain myself to anyone. Let them wonder, let them whisper. The truth didn't need an audience. I entered through the back door, the same back door I'd used for 10 years, keys jangling in one hand, grocery bags in the other, calling out, "I'm home," to people who now called me a burden. It was quiet, except for the soft hum of the fridge. The air smelled of lemon cleaner and dust, like a space waiting to be staged. I moved through it slowly, touching nothing, only observing. Like a nurse on final rounds, checking the vitals of a place she was about to leave behind. In the living room, I paused in front of the fireplace. The mantel still held the wooden family sign Grace had given us one Christmas, back when she still called me Miss Mabel with shy politeness. I left it there. I wasn't taking anything that didn't belong to me anymore. Only one task remained. I stepped into the kitchen and laid my black binder on the counter right in the center, where everyone had always tossed mail and grocery lists and half-eaten birthday cards. The counter still bore a faint scratch from when I dropped a screwdriver installing a child safety latch Grace never thanked me for. I opened the binder and smoothed the tabs. Mortgage, utilities, education, medical, wedding, extras. Each section held its story, not in emotion but in numbers. Receipts, transfers, copies of checks, dates, signatures, printed screenshots of Venmo payments and contractor quotes, letters from the university about Grace's tuition balance, invoices from the florist and venue, copies of bank statements showing the money flowing out of my account, again and again, like water from a faucet no one bothered to turn off. It was all there. And on top of it, one white envelope, sealed, with her name handwritten in ink that didn't shake. Grace. No, to my daughter. No, with love. No lie. Inside was one single page. A letter, not of apology, not of accusation, but of fact. Grace, you asked me to disappear. This is what disappears when I do. There is no anger in this, just accounting. I hope your wedding day is still beautiful. I won't be there to see it. Mabel. I placed the envelope on the binder and stood still for a moment, long enough to hear a car pass by outside, long enough to feel the years settle into my shoulders like a winter coat I could finally shrug off. I left through the front door, locking it behind me. I didn't take the key. That evening, I returned to the motel. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I sat in the folding chair by the window and listened to the motel's vending machine hum down the hall. In my lap, I held a photo from my wallet, Grace, age 19, sitting in the front seat of my car, grinning after passing her driving test. I'd driven her to the DMV, waited an hour in the cold, paid for her license, and taken her for pancakes afterward. She had called me her hero that day, half joking, half not. I stared at the photo until my eyes blurred. Then I tore it in half. The next morning, the phone calls started again, Frank's name flashing on the screen, then Grace's, then someone from the wedding venue, then the band. I let it all ring. By noon, my voicemail was full. They were panicking now. I imagined them pacing around the kitchen, trying to hold the narrative together. Frank raising his voice for the first time in years. Grace swearing under her breath, texting me insults she wouldn't say aloud. Maybe even checking the bank account. Finally realizing who had been paying for what. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still, and that stillness was a kind of power they would never understand. At 3 p.m., Dave called. "We've got 2 offers already," he said. "Want to counter?" "No," I said. "Accept one. Clean." He exhaled. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure." After I hung up, I walked to the corner market and bought a frozen lasagna and a bottle of red wine. Not to celebrate, but to mark the end of something. I didn't toast. I didn't light candles. I heated the food, poured a glass, and sat in silence, listening to the world move on outside my window. That night I wrote in my notebook. They took my name off the house. So I gave them what they asked for. Now they will learn what it meant to have me. The wedding was supposed to be 3 weeks away, but by Saturday morning, everything had already started unraveling. I hadn't posted anything online. I hadn't sent a message to anyone. But secrets have a funny way of rising to the surface once you stop holding them down. All it took was that "for sale" sign on the front lawn, white, square, unassuming, and a few curious eyes. Rick, our neighbor from across the street, texted me early. "Hey Mabel, just saw the sign. Everything okay?" I stared at his message for a full minute. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because no one else had asked that question. Not Frank, not Grace, not one person from church or the neighborhood committee had thought to check in with the one person whose name was suddenly gone from the mailbox. I typed back, "Thanks for asking. I'm okay, just clearing the air." He didn't reply. But an hour later, someone else did. "Grace." The text came in sharp, cold. "What are you trying to do?" "No, hello. No, why?" Just that. I didn't answer. She called 5 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Then Frank. Then the wedding planner. That one made me laugh. Apparently, they still thought they could go forward with the ceremony at the house. Still thought they had time to smooth things over. Still thought my silence meant permission. I finally picked up on the third call from Frank. His voice was tight, measured like he was trying to sound calm but couldn't quite manage it. "Mabel, we need to talk." I said nothing. "Mabel, this has gone too far. You're hurting, Grace." I took a slow breath. "I'm not doing anything I wasn't asked to do." There was a pause. "She didn't mean—" "She meant it," I interrupted. "And you clapped." The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and deep. I let it sit. I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to hear the weight of that moment again, the echo of his hands coming together in that quiet church hall, applauding my disappearance. "You're punishing us," he finally said. "No," I replied. "I'm stepping back. Like you both wanted." End quote. I hung up. That evening, I went to the small laundromat near the edge of town, not because I needed to wash much, but because the smell of detergent and warm air reminded me of stability. The hum of machines, the folding of clean towels, it all felt real, grounding. As I waited for the dryer, I opened my notebook again. I wrote, "They think I'm punishing them. They think this is revenge. They don't see it's survival." The next morning, the first of the wedding vendors called to cancel. The venue was no longer available. The permit void. Grace's name wasn't on the property title. Frank's alone wasn't enough for legal authorization. The insurance policy was in his name, yes, but the original approval had been processed under both of ours. Now it was a legal risk. They were learning the hard way that paperwork is power. By Monday, the band had backed out. The caterer left a voicemail asking who was now responsible for the remaining balance. I didn't reply. Let Frank handle it. Let Grace figure it out. They wanted me silent? Fine. Let them live in the silence. That afternoon, I returned to the rental office and extended my stay another 2 weeks. The woman at the counter asked if everything was okay. She was maybe 30, with tired eyes and a toddler tugging at her sleeve. "I'm rebuilding," I said. She nodded like she understood. On my way out, I passed an older man with a cart full of groceries and a black eye that looked at least a week old. We exchanged the kind of glance that only people who've had the rug pulled out from under them recognize, tight, brief, full of unspoken knowing. Later that night, Rick from across the street sent another message. "Grace came by, screaming, slamming doors. Thought you'd want to know." I thanked him. I didn't ask what she said. I didn't care. I could imagine it clearly enough, Grace in her designer coat, hair pulled tight, voice raised to a pitch only she found convincing. Tears, maybe, or rage, or both. I knew how it would look. To the neighbors, to the florist, to the church. Mabel, the stepmother, had lost it. She had ruined the wedding. She had taken her bitterness and weaponized it. But here's what they wouldn't say. That Mabel had paid the down payment on that house. That Mabel had kept the bills paid and the kitchen full. That Mabel had raised Grace from 16 to 28 with patience, money, and open hands. That Mabel had been erased with a sentence. And now Mabel had responded with facts. The binder sat quietly in that house, on the kitchen counter, waiting. Not a threat, not a warning, just truth, printed, tabbed, documented. And it was starting to ripple. By Wednesday, I received an email from Mark Grace's fiancé. We'd only met a few times. Polite young man, quiet, the kind who smiled too much and never said what he was thinking. He wrote, "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'd like to talk." I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to decide who I was now. Not the woman who fixed broken light switches. Not the stepmother who bought custom centerpieces. Not the woman who smiled through being left out of photos. I was the woman who had been erased. And now, I was writing myself back in. Mark asked to meet at a coffee shop just outside of town, the kind with handwritten chalkboard menus and soft jazz humming through overhead speakers. It was the kind of place Grace would never step foot in, too rustic, too plain, not enough gluten-free options. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat near the window. I ordered a chamomile tea and brought my notebook with me. I didn't plan to take notes, but it felt like armor. At exactly 2 p.m., Mark walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders a little hunched, eyes more tired. He wore a dark gray sweater, not the usual button-up Grace always seemed to dress him in. He scanned the room, saw me, and raised a hand awkwardly. "Hi, Miss Mabel." I nodded. "Sit." He did. A waitress came by and offered him coffee. He declined. His hands were clasped tight in front of him, knuckles pale. "I appreciate you agreeing to this," he said. I waited. "I didn't know about the house," he began. "Not the paperwork, not what they asked you to sign. I swear I didn't." "You didn't ask." His mouth opened, then closed again. He blinked. I continued. "You stood there while Grace insulted me. You didn't speak up. She said it was family business." I stared at him. "You're marrying into that family. You don't get to claim ignorance and innocence in the same breath." He swallowed hard. "Frank, he told me things were fine, that you were just being difficult." I gave a short, dry laugh. "Of course he did." There was a pause. The jazz song shifted to something slower. "I didn't come here to defend them," Mark said quietly. "I came because, well, I've started to see who they really are." I arched an eyebrow. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Grace has been spiraling, screaming at vendors, demanding my mother pay for upgrades she already said no to. She's furious about the house." End quote. "She thought it was hers." He nodded. "Frank promised it to her after the wedding, and they were so sure I'd just disappear. They thought you'd stay quiet." I stirred my tea slowly. "They always do. That's the mistake." He sat back. "I want to understand. I want to know what happened between you and them." I looked at him then, really looked. This wasn't a bad man, just a weak one, the kind who turns his head when truth becomes inconvenient, the kind Grace could mold, or so she thought. I didn't give him everything, but I told him enough. How I'd helped Grace through college when Frank's business went dry. How I paid for the down payment, the upgrades, the caterer. How I signed the papers Frank handed me, believing his lie about refinancing. How I stood in that church hall while Grace announced, loud and proud, that I was not welcome at her wedding. "How did you not lose your mind?" Mark asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I said, just quietly, like women like me always do. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "The wedding's off." I blinked. "What?" "I ended it yesterday," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "She screamed for an hour, called me a coward, said I was choosing a stranger over my future wife. And are you?" He met my gaze. "No, I'm choosing clarity." I nodded slowly. "That's rare. And costly. She lied to me, Mabel," he said. "About you, about the money, about everything." "She didn't lie. She just told her version of the truth. That's more dangerous." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I feel like a fool." "You should. But that's how wisdom starts." He looked up again. "What do you do now?" "I start over, quietly, with less, but on my own terms." He hesitated, then said, "Can I help?" I shook my head. "No, this isn't yours to fix." He looked almost relieved. "I don't hate you, Mark," I added. "But don't expect forgiveness on a timeline. Trust is rebuilt, not requested." "It's exemplar." He nodded. We sat in silence for a while. As we stood to leave, he pulled something from his coat pocket. "It's Grace's," he said, handing me a small velvet box. "I found it in my drawer this morning. Inside was my wedding ring, the one I'd left in its box on the dresser the day I walked out. She said you wouldn't need it anymore." I took the box gently. "She's right. As I stepped out into the cold, I didn't look back. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. That night, back at the motel, I opened the binder one more time. I added a new section, Future. I left it blank. For now. Sunday morning rolled in, heavy and gray, the kind of sky that warned of snow but never delivered. I hadn't been to church in weeks, not since the rehearsal meeting turned humiliation. But something pulled me back that day, not faith, not ritual, but something deeper. I needed to be seen. Not in vengeance, in survival. I dressed simply. A navy coat, black slacks, the same pearl earrings I wore the first time I met Grace. I parked 2 blocks away from St. Luke's, walked slowly toward the steps like someone visiting a grave. The bells rang just as I reached the doors. Inside, it was warm, familiar, still smelled like lemon oil and old hymnals. The ushers nodded politely, not sure what to say. I gave a half smile, found my usual pew near the back, and sat. The choir began. Voices rose, and I just breathed. A few minutes later, I heard her before I saw her. Mabel? I turned. It was Loretta Bell, church secretary, gossip wrangler, keeper of all moral records in town. She looked me over like she was checking for bruises. "Well, honey, you've sure stirred the pot," she said, sliding in next to me. "Good morning to you too, Loretta." She didn't smile. "I heard what happened." "Which part?" She leaned in. "All of it." I waited. "Grace came crying to Pastor Earl on Wednesday," she continued. "Said you were unstable. Said you ruined her wedding out of spite." I raised an eyebrow. "And what did Pastor Earl say?" He said, "Maybe next time, don't throw a woman out of her own home and expect her to bake the cake afterward." I chuckled. "He said that?" "He did," she confirmed. Then he told her the church wasn't available for rescheduling. I turned fully toward her now. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've seen what you've done for that girl," she said, her voice softening. "And some of us remember." We sat in silence as the sermon began. The pastor preached about seeds falling on rocky ground, about things that don't grow when love isn't real, about storms revealing foundations. When service ended, I stood to leave, but Loretta grabbed my hand. "Come by the office this week," she said. "We've got a few things we'd like you to help with. Committee's a mess without you." I smiled. "I thought I was canceled." She rolled her eyes. "Honey, canceling is for Twitter. This is a church. We gossip, we judge, but we remember who brings the pies." I left the sanctuary with something small and unfamiliar flickering in my chest, something like hope. Outside, the air was sharp. I stood on the steps, watching families file out, children pulling coats over their heads, older couples linking arms. Community, that's what they couldn't erase. Back at the motel, I warmed leftover lasagna and poured a glass of ginger ale. I sat with the binder on the table and flipped to the Future tab, still blank. Until now. I pulled out my notepad. On a fresh page, I wrote, 1. Volunteer twice a week. 2. Take a solo trip. 3. Change mailing address. 4. Apply for the part-time nursing coordinator job at Mercy. The last one made me pause. It had been 5 years since I last worked a shift. Frank had said I didn't need to work anymore, that he had everything handled. And like a fool, I believed that meant he valued me. Now, I knew better. It was time to earn for myself again. I opened my laptop and visited the Mercy Hospital website. The job was still posted. Flexible hours, retirement benefits, familiar hallways. I clicked apply. As the form loaded, my phone buzzed. Another voicemail. I didn't recognize the number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to listen. It was from Denise Frank's sister. "Hey Mabel, I don't know where to start. I just heard. Frank didn't tell anyone the truth. He said you left for no reason. But Grace said something at a family dinner last night. Bragged, really. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. For not asking sooner, for believing them, and for letting you stand alone." I replayed it once, then again. Then I deleted it, not out of bitterness, but because I didn't need her guilt. I needed my peace. That night, I closed the binder. I placed it in my suitcase gently, with care, not because I was done with it, but because I no longer needed to prove what I already knew. I had been erased, and now I had reappeared. The following Friday, I returned to the house one last time, not to collect what was mine, not to confront anyone, just to retrieve a box I had nearly forgotten about until a dream the night before brought it roaring back. In the dream, I was back in the kitchen, barefoot on the tile, humming an old Sam Cooke tune. I opened the cabinet above the fridge, where I used to keep the ginger tea, and instead found an envelope with my mother's handwriting. I woke up sweating. Of course, the letter didn't exist, but the memory it pulled from the depths did. There was a box in the attic, one I packed away during the first year of marriage, full of old letters, photos, my nursing license, and a few family mementos. I had tucked it up there, just for now, when we moved in before Grace, before the marriage became a transaction, before the truth was coated in pleasantries. So I went back. The house was still technically Frank's, at least on paper. But the for sale sign was faded now, and the place looked hollow, empty, like it had exhaled after holding its breath too long. I used the back key one last time. The air inside had changed. It smelled like boxes and wood and the kind of stillness that follows after a family breaks. There were footprints in the dust where furniture had been moved, and the once cheerful throw pillows now sat stacked in a sad pile by the wall. I didn't linger. I headed for the attic, pulling down the ladder from the hallway ceiling. It creaked, same as always. I climbed up into the stale darkness, guided by a single bulb that hung from a fraying cord. The attic was cold and silent. I found the box within minutes, labeled MH in faded Sharpie. I pulled it toward me, sat cross-legged on the wood floor, and opened it. Inside were pieces of a life I hadn't touched in years. A Polaroid of me at 23, holding a stethoscope in one hand and a bouquet in the other, beaming in front of Mercy Hospital on my first day. A letter from my mother, dated 1998, filled with neat cursive and Southern wisdom. Keep something for yourself, baby. Always. I have an inch down. Underneath that, my nursing pins faded thank you cards from patients, and the first recipe I ever made for Grace, peach cobbler on wide-ruled paper, sticky with old sugar stains. I held that one the longest. It wasn't the cobbler she remembered, it was the hours I spent teaching her how to measure, how to fold, how to wait for the crust to brown. She used to call it Miss Mabel's Sunday Magic. She hadn't called me anything sweet in years. I repacked the box gently, closing the lid like a ritual. When I climbed back down, I didn't look around the house. What was left had nothing to do with me. On the way out, I passed the kitchen counter. The binder was still there, unopened, untouched. I left it. Frank could read it. Or not. Grace could tear it up. Or frame it. None of it mattered anymore. Truth is not a sword. It's a mirror. You can ignore it, but one day, you'll catch your reflection. I dropped the attic box into the trunk of my car and drove back to the motel. As I parked, I saw someone sitting on the steps outside Loretta, in a thick winter coat, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "Girl, you're hard to catch," she said. I laughed. "What are you doing here?" She handed me a cup. "Church committee voted. We want you back." I blinked. "Back?" "Head of hospitality," she said. "We're done letting Grace's gossip define the truth." I took a slow sip. It was hot. Strong. "You sure?" I asked. She gave me a look. "You were the only one who ever organized a potluck without somebody throwing deviled eggs." We both laughed. I hadn't realized how much I missed that sound. Later that night, I sat by the window in my motel room, the attic box beside me. I didn't cry. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally found its place. Tomorrow, I would move into a small apartment 2 towns over. Nothing fancy, just mine. The kind of place where no one clapped when I was told to vanish. The kind of place where I didn't need to ask permission to be wanted. That night, I wrote one more line in my notebook. This is what healing sounds like. Silence that doesn't hurt. The new apartment wasn't much, 700 square feet, 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and floors that creaked when you walked too heavy. But when I unlocked the door for the first time, I didn't feel disappointed. I felt home. It was mine. Just mine. No one had chosen the curtains for me. No one told me where to hang the calendar or which shelf should hold the keys. There were no family photos I was expected to include myself in. No passive-aggressive sticky notes on the fridge about almond milk or gluten. Just space. Quiet, modest, waiting. I placed the attic box in the center of the living room floor. The binder joined it, set carefully beside a lamp that had followed me through every stage of life since my 20s. I set a fresh notepad on the counter and brewed a cup of coffee with the small French press I'd splurged on at the corner store. Then I sat cross-legged on the floor, back straight, hands wrapped around the warm mug. I exhaled. It wasn't just about leaving the house anymore. It was about remembering who I had been before I signed my name away to people who never planned to honor it. I started unpacking. The bookshelf came first, lined with the stories I'd once gotten lost in, now ready to be rediscovered. A few cookbooks, Baldwin, Maya Angelou, my Bible, annotated and tear-stained. A tiny ceramic angel Grace made in 5th grade, tucked in the back of a drawer and somehow forgotten in the attic box. I placed her on the top shelf, not because she deserved it, but because I did. The walls were still bare, and I didn't rush to fill them. There was a kind of holiness in starting over slowly. That afternoon, I walked to the corner grocery store and bought a carton of eggs, a loaf of sourdough, and 2 peaches that smelled like summer even in late October. The cashier, a kind-looking young man with braids and chipped nail polish, smiled. "You just move in?" I nodded. "Yes. First day. Need help carrying it out?" "No, baby. I've carried heavier." He grinned. "You take care now." "I will," I said. Back in the apartment, I made myself a simple breakfast for dinner: scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and 1 sliced peach. I ate it slowly at the little table by the window, watching the sun dip below the rooftop across the street. This was not the life I imagined, but it was mine. Later that evening, as I unpacked the last of my things, I found an old photograph, me and my mother, sitting on a park bench, our legs nearly touching. She had her arm draped around my shoulders like a shield. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it into the corner of the mirror above my dresser. When I turned away, I caught my own reflection. I didn't look like a woman discarded. I looked like a woman returned. At 8:45 p.m., my phone buzzed. "Frank." I let it ring. He called again. Then a message. "Please talk to me. It's not what you think." I didn't open it. Instead, I texted 2 words back. Too late. It was, the wedding had been canceled. Not postponed. Not relocated. Canceled. Mark moved out. Grace moved back in with her mother in Chicago. The house remained on the market, collecting dust and lowball offers. Word spread, as it always does in small towns. People were polite, but different. They stopped me at the post office, lowered their voices when they asked questions. I never gave them the full story. They didn't deserve it. But I let them look in my eyes and know I was still standing. 1 week after moving in, I received a small box in the mail. No return address. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was the peach cobbler recipe Grace had written in her teenage handwriting. No note. Just the paper, soft with years. I didn't cry, but I did place it beside the angel on the shelf. Let the record show, I didn't burn the bridge. I just stopped rebuilding it. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No sounds but the rustle of trees outside my window, no weight on my chest but the rhythm of my own breath. Peace, I realized, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives like this: quiet, firm, mine. 2 weeks after the move, I was folding laundry in the small, sunlit corner of my apartment when an envelope slid under my door. No knock, no footsteps, just the soft shh of paper on hardwood and then silence. I stared at it for a moment. Cream-colored, heavy, my name written in cursive I didn't recognize. No return address. I picked it up with the same caution you'd use for something ticking. Inside was an invitation to Grace's recommitment ceremony, held in Chicago, at her mother's estate. Formal attire requested. Despite unexpected changes, it read, "We are choosing to celebrate love, family, and new beginnings." The card was thick, embossed, expensive. A note was scrawled at the bottom in sharp black ink. "Thought you should know. G." I sat down slowly. No apology. No explanation. Just another performance. Another event where the optics mattered more than the truth. A recommitment ceremony. After a canceled wedding. With no fiancé in sight. This wasn't about love. It was about control. She wanted me to see it. To feel excluded. To feel regret. But I didn't. I felt something else. Relief. Because for the first time, her noise didn't reach me. I placed the invitation on the kitchen counter beside a small candle I lit every morning. It smelled like cedar and orange peel, comforting, clean, intentional. That afternoon, I walked down to the church for the committee meeting Loretta had roped me into. I brought my binder. Not the binder, but a new one, navy blue, labeled simply, Hospitality. Inside were meal plans, volunteer rosters, allergy lists, and a few handwritten recipes I wanted to try with the team. We gathered in the church basement, surrounded by folding chairs and strong coffee. Loretta opened the meeting with her usual flair. "Let's get down to business, Saints. Potluck ain't gonna organize itself." Everyone chuckled. I smiled and passed out the volunteer sheets. We talked about food drives, casserole sign-ups, and who was bringing cornbread. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost haunting someone else's life. I felt rooted, present, needed. Halfway through, during a lull in chatter, one of the women, Evelyn, a retired school librarian, touched my arm gently. "You okay, Mabel?" she asked. I looked at her and said, "Honestly, I think I'm starting to be." When I got home, the apartment felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. I reheated a bowl of vegetable soup, wrapped myself in my favorite shawl, and sat by the window with my tea. Across the street, a young couple argued gently while walking their dog. A teenager skateboarded past, headphones in. Life moved on, and so had I. Later, I took out the invitation again, ran my fingers over the embossed gold. Then, without drama, I dropped it in the trash. No fire, no tears, just a choice. She had her stage. I had my piece. That night, I dreamed of my mother again. She was sitting at the same park bench, smiling, patting the seat beside her like she had all the time in the world. I sat. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. When I woke, I wrote in my notebook. She invited me to her performance. I declined. Not every audience is obligated. The first thing I did that Monday morning was clip my old nurse's badge to my sweater. It felt strange, familiar, but foreign. Like picking up a song you hadn't sung in years. Your throat knows the tune, but the words need time to find their rhythm again. Mercy Hospital hadn't changed much. The lobby still smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and weak coffee. The same volunteer sat behind the front desk, a sweet man named Harold who once flirted with me just enough to make me blush, and never more. He didn't recognize me at first, but when I signed in and handed over my ID, his eyes lit up. "Mabel Hargrove," he said, smiling. "Well, I'll be." "I'm back," I said. "Part-time?" He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that carried memory. "Good. The place has been too quiet without your spirit." I made my way to the volunteer coordinator's office. A woman named Janice greeted me with warm eyes and 2 cups of coffee. She handed me my schedule, a mix of front desk, patient escort, and administrative help. "Ease back in," she said. "You don't have to prove anything." I smiled, but inside, I felt a tremor, because that's all I'd ever done. Prove myself. Quietly, steadily, without complaint. I'd proven I was a good stepmother, a good wife, a good neighbor. I had nodded, smiled, smoothed things over. I had never demanded space or credit. And still, they erased me. But here, at Mercy, they remembered. As I walked down the hall toward the nurses' station, I passed familiar faces, doctors, techs, aides. Some nodded. Others stopped me, arms wide. "Mabel, you're back. What took you so long?" I laughed and shrugged. "Got lost for a while, but I found my way. It's not really desolate." One of the patients, an older woman named Patricia, saw me wheeling a supply cart past her room and called out, "Miss Mabel, you back on your rounds?" "I am," I said, stepping in. She patted the edge of her bed. "Good. These young things don't know how to tuck a sheet for nothing." I sat and helped adjust her pillows. She looked me in the eye and said softly, "You always had a way of making people feel seen." That caught me, because lately, that's all I had craved, to be seen. Not praised, not pitied, just recognized. I finished my shift around 3, tucked my badge back into my coat pocket, and walked to the diner down the street, an old spot with red booths and staff who called you baby, whether they knew your name or not. I slid into a booth by the window and ordered a slice of apple pie and black coffee. As I stirred in cream, I heard the jingle of the front door. Frank, I recognized the silhouette before the face. He hadn't seen me yet. But I didn't flinch, didn't duck. He ordered something to go, then turned and froze when he saw me. Our eyes locked. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he walked over. Mind if I sit? I looked at the empty seat, then at him. 2 minutes. He nodded and slid into the booth. He looked older, more tired. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie crooked. Grace is in Chicago, he said, as if I asked. With her mother. I sipped my coffee. He cleared his throat. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. Until after you left. I nodded once. And the binder. That was for me, I said. Not for guilt, not for revenge, just to remember who I was. He looked down at his hands. I miss you. I looked out the window. The sun was setting, throwing gold across the pavement. A child was spinning in circles on the sidewalk, arms wide, laughing at nothing. I turned back to Frank. You miss the version of me who never asked for anything, I said. That woman's gone. He blinked. I never meant. You meant to get away with it, I said. And you almost did. He didn't speak. I stood, dropped a few dollars on the table for the pie, and slipped my coat on. You don't get 2 minutes more. As I walked out, the cold air bit my cheeks. It felt clean. I didn't look back. That night, I opened my journal, wrote one sentence. I served. I gave. I vanished. Now, I returned for me. A till ground. 2 weeks into the new apartment, I invited 3 women from the church over for Sunday lunch. Nothing fancy. Just a roast chicken, collard greens, sweet potatoes, and cornbread made the way my mama used to, with buttermilk and a pinch of sugar, even if she swore she didn't add any. I set the table with the good dishes I'd packed away for holidays that never came. The ones Frank said were too nice for just us. Turns out, I was never part of us. But this time, the table was mine. Loretta was the first to arrive, with Evelyn right behind, carrying a peach cobbler that made the apartment smell like my childhood. Janice from the hospital came too, with fresh lemonade and a bag of linen napkins she insisted were on clearance, but I knew better. We laughed. We prayed. We passed the bread like communion. It wasn't just a meal. It was reclamation. I watched them eat, chat, joke, bless. These women who had seen me break quietly and put myself back together with no applause. They didn't ask about Frank or Grace. They didn't need to. Their presence said enough. You cooked like you had something to prove, Loretta teased, wiping her mouth with one of Janice's napkins. I did, I said with a smile. To myself, we lingered for hours. When the sun dipped low and the conversation turned soft, Evelyn leaned across the table. You ever think about leading a women's circle again? She asked. I blinked. She continued, we need someone who speaks like you. From experience. From scar tissue, not scripture. I swallowed. I don't know, I said. I'm not sure I'm ready to be a teacher again. She smiled. Sometimes all people need is someone brave enough to speak first. That night, after the last dish was dried and stacked, I stood in the quiet of my apartment and let the silence settle. It was full. Alive. The kind of stillness that follows good work, good people, good food. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just breathed. My phone buzzed around 8 p.m. A new message. Grace, I heard you're holding little church dinners now. That's cute. If you think this makes you noble, it doesn't. You're still just bitter. I stared at the words for a long moment, not because they hurt, but because they didn't. Grace was still performing a play no one was watching, and I had left the theater. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my notebook and added 2 more items to the future tab. 5. Start a women's circle. Leo. Invite only those who bring peace. Before bed, I lit a candle, placed it near the photo of my mother, and whispered, I'm all right now. Because I was. Not perfect. Not healed all the way through. But all right. And for a woman who had once been clapped out of her own life, that was everything. It started as a suggestion, something Loretta threw out during a women's circle meeting 2 weeks after that Sunday lunch. We should hold a community grief gathering, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. Not for funerals, just for the things people lose that no one gives them flowers for. I sat quietly for a moment, because I knew that loss intimately. There had been no casseroles dropped off at my door when Grace and Frank betrayed me. No sympathy cards, no visits, no whispered, "You don't deserve this." Only silence. "You want me to host it?" I asked softly. "I want you to lead it," she replied. A few days later, the church board approved it. A monthly gathering, open to the public, no religion required, just space to speak and be heard. The first session would be held in the church's side hall. They gave me a key, my own clipboard, a sign-in sheet. I didn't ask for any of it, but they gave it anyway. The morning of the first meeting, I arrived early, set up chairs in a soft circle, brewed coffee in the kitchen, and placed a small sign on the door. Quiet voices, open hearts, all welcome. People started arriving slowly. A widower who'd lost his wife of 47 years. A woman whose adult daughter hadn't spoken to her in 6 years. A teenage boy who never met his father and wanted to talk to someone who wouldn't pity him. They sat. They shared. They cried. And I did too. Not loudly, not to take up space, but to join them in the truth of what it meant to be human. Grief doesn't have to be death. Sometimes grief is betrayal. Sometimes it's the hollow left by someone who once called you mom. At the end of the meeting, a woman with deep lines around her mouth pulled me aside. "You should put your name on the door," she said. I smiled. "It's just a borrowed room." "No," she said firmly. "I mean this. What you're doing, it matters. Own it." That night, I stood in my apartment, staring at my binder. Future. What started as blank pages now had dates, schedules, goals, little scribbles in the margins. A flyer mock-up I was designing with Loretta's granddaughter, notes from women who wanted to co-host grief circles in their neighborhoods. And then it hit me. All this time, I thought I had lost my place in the world. But I was carving a new one. Not as Frank's wife. Not as Grace's convenient stepmother. As Mabel. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper, wrote in bold letters, "The Quiet Rebuild." That would be the name of our gathering, the name of what this was becoming. I taped it to my fridge, because that was my name now. Not a woman erased. Not a woman betrayed. A woman rebuilding. Quietly, deeply, authentically. A week later, I received a registered letter at my apartment. From Frank. Inside was a typed note and a check. A large one. "This is yours. I know now. I can't undo what we did, but I hope this helps you finish what you've started. F." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't money that moved me. It was the sentence. "What you've started." Because finally, even he saw it. I had started something. Not out of bitterness. Out of truth. And truth, once it finds breath, doesn't ask permission to grow. The check from Frank sat untouched on my kitchen counter for 3 days. Not because I didn't need the money, I did. My savings were thin, and the hospital only paid part-time hours, but because the gesture deserved a pause. He had spent years asking for silence, and now he was offering money in the shape of an apology. But what I wanted had never been money. It had been respect. Grace had never reached out again, not since the last text. That silence, sharp, clean, was its own kind of closure. She was building her life in Chicago now, far from small-town stares and the pieces of a wedding that never came together. I wondered if she ever passed by bridal shops with her head down. I wondered if she told people I had ruined it all. I stopped wondering when I realized it didn't change anything. That Friday, I finally cashed the check. Then I wrote a letter. Not to Frank. To Grace. I didn't intend to send it. I wrote it for me. It read, "Grace, you once said I wasn't your mother. You were right. I wasn't the one who gave you life, but I was the one who stayed. The one who taught you how to drive. Who waited at the ER when you broke your wrist? Who stood in line at the registrar's office when your financial aid fell through? Who made the cobbler your friends begged for at sleepovers? I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because I believed in family, even when family didn't believe in me. You told a room full of people that you didn't want to see me at your wedding. You got your wish, and now I have mine. I see myself clearly, not as your shadow, not as his helper, but as a whole person. I hope one day you learn the difference between power and kindness, between status and character, between performance and truth. I hope you build a life that doesn't need to erase others to shine, I hope you find peace, because I finally have. Mabel. I folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of my journal. Some truths don't need to be sent, just written. That same evening, Loretta and I visited the community center across town. They were hosting a small gathering of women widows, retirees, single mothers interested in creating their own healing circles. I spoke for 15 minutes about the quiet rebuild, not as something I led, but something I had lived. Afterward, one woman, maybe 60, approached me. She said, "When you talked about being erased, I felt like you were reading my diary." I smiled. "We've all had our pages torn out. The healing is in rewriting them." She nodded, eyes full. "I used to think I was too old to start again," she whispered. I reached out, squeezed her hand. "It's never too late to claim your own name." That night, I walked home under a sky so clear it hurt to look at, stars above me like tiny flames that refused to burn out. In the distance, a train rumbled past, and I thought if I had taken Grace's rejection as final, if I had accepted Frank's applause as my worth, I would have missed all of this. The meals, the circles, the women who saw me, not as a cautionary tale, but as a guidepost. I wrote one more line in my notebook before bed. Some doors close quietly. Others, you have to shut yourself. Both lead to freedom. On the first day of spring, I added 2 folding chairs to the circle at the church. Not because I expected anyone new, but because I was learning to make room for healing, for chance, for whatever and whoever was meant to come next. That afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. It streamed through the stained glass windows, pooling onto the wood floors like honey. The group arrived slowly, as they always did, some with baked goods, some with tired smiles, some with burdens they hadn't named out loud yet. We began, as always, with breath. I had learned the rhythm now, how to hold space, how to nod without fixing, how to let silence be sacred. When it was my turn to speak, I told them about the letter I wrote but never mailed. I didn't say who it was for, just that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell your truth where only you can hear it. After the meeting, as I packed up coffee cups and folded blankets, I noticed someone hovering at the door. Frank. He looked smaller than before. Not physically, just reduced. He held a folder in one hand, the same color as the binder I'd left behind. "I saw your flyer at the diner," he said softly. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked toward him. "You here for healing or for answers?" He opened the folder and handed me a sheet. A deed. To the house. Signed back over to me. "I'm selling it anyway," I said. "I know," he replied, "but I needed to make it right before you did." I took the paper and studied his face. There was no smugness, no expectation of redemption, just effort. He stepped back. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to give it back." I nodded, folded the paper, and tucked it into my bag. He turned to leave, but paused. "Grace is still in Chicago," he said. I said nothing. "She asked if I'd spoken to you." Still, I was quiet. He added, "She doesn't understand why you're doing all this. The group, the speaking, the peace." Finally, I looked at him. "That's the difference between us," I said. "You both thought control was the same as love. I don't need to be in the spotlight to have a voice." He swallowed hard. "You're stronger than me." "No," I said, "just quieter." He nodded once and left. I returned to the folding chairs and placed one more next to mine. Not because I needed it filled, because every seat I offer now is one I choose. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment with a cup of mint tea and the house deed in front of me. I thought about all the nights I cried into my pillow, wondering if I was crazy. If I had imagined the betrayal, if I had somehow asked for it. This paper didn't undo that, but it acknowledged it. And acknowledgement, I've learned, is a kind of balm. I called Dave, the real estate agent, and told him to continue the sale. Then I opened my notebook and wrote, "Closure isn't a ceremony. It's a quiet chair you no longer have to fill." I didn't need the house. I had a home now in myself. The following Sunday, I hosted brunch again. This time, there were 6 women around my small kitchen table, twice as many as last time, each bringing a story, a dish, and a softness they didn't show in public. The kind of women who had been someone's everything for years, only to be left holding silence and casseroles when they were no longer needed. We laughed louder this time. No one flinched when stories turned sharp. No one apologized for tears. Evelyn brought fresh-baked muffins. Janice made a strawberry salad. Loretta brought a framed photo from her younger years, her standing on a porch in Mississippi, arms crossed, chin up, eyes full of fire. "You see her?" she said, tapping the glass. She thought she had to shrink herself to stay loved. She looked around the table. She was wrong. That landed. We clinked glasses not to forget the men or the betrayals or the years we bent ourselves backwards, but to honor the women we were now. After they left, I sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, tea in hand, and stared at the tiny plant on my sill, a gift from the teenage boy who came to Grief Circle once and never returned. He said he didn't need to. He just wanted to thank me. The plant had 3 leaves now. A miracle, really, considering I'd never had a green thumb. But somehow, it kept growing. Around sunset, there was a knock at my door. A soft one. I opened it to find a woman I didn't recognize at first. Early 40s, nervous, holding a tray of lemon bars. "I'm sorry to just show up," she said. "I got your name from the church. I heard about the group, the Grief Circle." I nodded. "You're welcome to come." She hesitated. "Is it okay if I don't talk the first time?" I opened the door wider. We've all had days like that. She stepped in. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray. "I lost myself in a marriage that didn't love me back," she whispered. I didn't say, "I understand." I didn't need to. I just made tea. We sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that isn't awkward, it's sacred. When she finally left, she said, "Thank you for not asking me to explain." I smiled. We've all had to explain too much to people who weren't listening. That night I pulled out my notebook and added, 7. Make space for the quiet ones. 8. Stay open for the ones who still whisper. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced, just me, in my socks, on creaky wooden floors, to an old Sam Cooke song playing softly from the radio. I spun once, laughed, and let myself feel the joy of returning not to the past, but to myself. It rained the day the house sold. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle, the kind that soaks in slow and makes the air feel like a blanket. I watched it from my apartment window, holding a cup of black coffee and the final copy of the sale papers in my lap. David called that morning. All signed, all done. Full price offer, cash buyer, closing in 2 weeks. I'd thanked him, then sat down quietly to feel it. The house that had once held my sacrifices, my laughter, my dignity, and later, my betrayal, was no longer mine. Not by theft, not by law. I had released it. In every way. That afternoon, I walked to the post office and mailed a final envelope to Frank. Inside was a copy of the signed deed, a list of itemized repairs I had paid for, and a small note. No balance due. I've settled it without bitterness, but not without memory. It wasn't forgiveness. It was justice, the quiet kind. I passed Rick, the neighbor, on my way back. He tipped his hat, offered a soft, "Heard the house sold." "It did," I said. "Grace still mad?" I smiled gently. "Grace has her own battles now. I've laid mine down. It's some to have it." He nodded like a man who'd seen more than he said. "You ever need a light changed or the car jumped? You know where I'm at." "Thank you, Rick." Later that evening, the Grief Circle gathered again. We didn't meet at the church this time. We met at my apartment. 6 women, 3 folding chairs, 1 space filled with warmth. We lit a candle. Held hands, no agenda, no speaker, just presence. Loretta brought her grandniece, a shy young woman fresh out of a bad marriage. She barely spoke above a whisper, but she listened like every word might matter. After we closed the circle, she stayed behind to help clean up. As she wiped the table, she looked at me and asked, "How do you know when you're finally free?" I thought for a long moment, then said, "When you don't need anyone to clap for you because the silence feels like applause." She nodded slowly and smiled. That night, after everyone left, I opened my binder one final time. Future was now filled, not with perfect plans, but with steps, meetings, names of women I wanted to check on, ideas for potlucks and speakers and writing workshops. And in the very back, one last tab, legacy. In it, I placed the letter I had written to Grace, now neatly typed, still unsent, still true. I wrote another beneath it. To any woman reading this, you are not what they took. You are what you kept, what you built, what you refused to let die. They do not get to name your story. You do. And it begins again every time you say, "No more." I slipped it into a plastic sleeve, closed the binder, placed it on my bookshelf between The Color Purple and a cookbook I used once every Thanksgiving. That binder, born from betrayal, had become a map. Not back to who I was, but forward to who I had become. That night, I slept with the window cracked open, letting the rain speak soft against the sill. And I dreamed not of Grace, not of Frank, but of women in circles, passing bread, exchanging strength, writing their own names at the top of the page, and smiling as they began again. The lesson from this story is clear and quietly powerful. Your worth is not defined by who accepts you, but by how you choose to rebuild when they don't. Mabel's journey reminds us that silence isn't weakness, and walking away isn't surrender, it's strength. Justice doesn't always come in loud declarations. Sometimes it arrives in steady choices, open doors, and the courage to start over with dignity. In a world that often tries to erase the quiet, the loyal, the women who give everything, we learn that reclaiming your voice doesn't require permission, only truth.